I want to welcome all as they're joining and turn it over to Kathy Tamsberg to get us going.
Thank you, Alison. I'm Kathy Tamsberg. I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina. My faith community is Pullen Memorial Baptist, and it's really nice to be with all of you today. On behalf of the executive committee and the board, we're just thrilled at all the good work that the Justice in Palestine and Israel community is doing on a variety of related topics, but particularly on this one, and it feels really, really timely that we're addressing it. So welcome, we're glad you're here and are willing to take some time on a Saturday afternoon to join us and learn more about the issue and also what we need to do about it. Let me, as our prayer, I want to offer some words from Nan Merrill's version of Psalm 40. I waited patiently for the beloved who heard my cry and came to me. Blessed are those who make love their home. Sacrifice and offering are not your desire for us, for you have opened our heart's ear. Burnt offerings are not required. I tell the glad news of love's way to all who will listen. I aspire to reveal your steadfast love and truth through the witness of my life. Let all that keeps me from love, from peace and gratitude, be transformed within me. For now, where injustice or illusion make their home, I witness to your peace and love, O teacher and friend to all. Amen.
Thank you, Kathy. And let me add my own welcome. I am Alison Tanner, pastor of Public Witness at Lakeshore Avenue Baptist Church, and a shout out to all the Lakeshore members who are here. Lakeshore is a longtime partner congregation with the Alliance of Baptists. In fact, we found you in 1996 when our congregation was disfellowshipped for welcoming and affirming peoples of all sexual orientations. And when the American Baptists weren't sure if they wanted to hang out with us, it meant so much for you to have your open arms around, and we've been partnering ever since. I am also the convener of the Justice in Palestine and Israel community for the Alliance of Baptists. And I'm so grateful for the ways that the Alliance has supported the Palestinian struggle for liberation and self-determination over the years, long before I was even aware of the need and the urgency, and for the ways in which you continue to show up even in this moment for a much needed discussion on Christian Zionism and how we can challenge it. I had the privilege of representing the Alliance of Baptists in Advent of 2018 and 2019 in Bethlehem. I traveled to the gatherings of Kairos Palestine and Global Kairos for Justice. And indeed, Paula Clayton Dempsey was so glad to have me representing the Alliance of Baptists at these gatherings that she actually created a volunteer title for me. She said, I think you really need to be our Palestinian advocacy representative. So I, with that title, I went to Bethlehem, where I heard from Palestinians on the ground about the increasingly direness of their situation. And I gathered with an international community of Christians who were seeking liberation for the Palestinian people and for their own people. And together we were a manifestation of the international Christian community that stood together for liberation, knowing that each of our understandings of the church would be fully realized only when we stood together, and that each of our understandings of who the God of liberation was and is and what she is up ground, ways in which we were reminded that their ever increasing oppression is supported by US tax dollars and by political sanction. And there was a specific call to the international Christian community to challenge Christian Zionism, the distortion and appropriation of Christian theology used to galvanize political support for the Zionist project of colonizing Palestinian land and resources and people and culture to create a Jewish supremacist state. They explained to us how Christian scriptures are being used to fuel the support for Israel, particularly from the US, but also globally, and also how Christian Zionism is actually the current driving force behind their increasing oppression. Christian Zionism is essentially Christian support for the Zionist project. And I want to be clear that not all Israelis are Zionists, not all Jews support Zionism, but the century-old Zionist project is alive and well, and it continues to displace people and dehumanize people and destroy entire communities and criminalize people and creates refugees and countless martyrs. It continues its practices of racial othering and ensuring second and even third class status for those who remain in the Holy Land. Christian Zionism has its conservative manifestations with dispensationalism and end times theology, but it also has its progressive manifestations, which I want the Alliance to be especially aware of. And its progressive manifestations basically having blind support for Israel, specifically within the church, and morphing the ancient biblical story with the modern day actions of a self-proclaimed Jewish supremacist state. Christian Zionism is embedded in pro-Israel ideology, which is rampant in the US. And it's so prevalent that without a critical lens, we become susceptible at Advent when we sing, O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel. We become susceptible to the damages of this dominant and destructive narrative. Because it's so pervasive, we need to be aware of the ways in which it infiltrates every aspect of the church. Because of the power of Christian Zionism, Palestinian Christians have pleaded with the international community, and especially the US community, because as the US loves to import all its evils throughout the world, Christianity in the US through the missionary project has also imported the evils of Christian Zionism. So the international church has challenged us, and the Palestinian church has challenged not only the international church, but especially the US church to do everything in our power to challenge Christian Zionism and the evils being done in its name. And while I can't share with you exactly what I heard when I was in Bethlehem, I can share with you the cry of hope and call to decisive action, which was written and put out by Palestinian Christians in July of 2020, reiterating the same call. And when our community asked Paula Clayton Dempsey to sign on behalf of the Alliance to this cry of hope and call to decisive action, she said, I will do so only if your community continues to put this commitment before the Alliance. I will not sign this if all I'm doing is signing it, but if we are going to make this commitment and your community is going to empower the larger Alliance to live out this commitment, then we can make it. And so that is what we're doing. We are answering this call to educate the Alliance to the harms of Christian Zionism and Alliance congregations, to implore the Alliance to pass a statement decrying the evils of Christian Zionism. And this fall at our fall gathering, the statement will be brought before the larger Alliance to vote on. We are asking the Alliance to commit as an organization, and we were asking all Alliance congregations to commit as congregations to publicly challenge Christian Zionism as part of our advocacy for justice, equality, and freedom for Palestinians and for all people. And at the risk of stating the obvious, here's why the Alliance needs to pay attention to Christian Zionism. Because Palestinians are engaged in the same liberative struggles for equality, for freedom, for justice, for self-determination that we are committed to. Because Palestinian Christians are challenging the same malevolent forces of empire, the same types of death-dealing theologies, and they are responding to the same call to followers of Jesus to serve the gospel of liberation. They are asking us to stand with them in challenging all theologies that oppress others, and to affirm the intersectional vision of liberation of all of God's children, acknowledging our responsibility to be the international body of Christ. So with that, we have a few speakers that are going to come and talk to us a little bit more about Christian Zionism, understanding its politics, its theology, and what we can do about it. The first of these, and then following these, there will be an opportunity for question and answer. So as you're listening, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or save them for the end. But let me now call on Jonathan Brennaman, a Palestinian American Christian and longtime advocate for Palestinian rights in the Mennonite tradition. He and I worked together on a project in the summer of 2018 to counter CUFI, Christians United for Israel. And during this event in DC, we were able to disrupt CUFI's conference to problematize the presence of then Vice President Mike Pence and the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who were there specifically to conflate their political power with Christian Zionist beliefs. Jonathan, thank you for being present with us and for sharing with us the dangers of the political powers of Christian Zionism.
Thank you, Alison, and it's great to be here with you all. As a Palestinian Christian challenging colonialism in my context, I also want to start by acknowledging that I'm calling in today from unceded Onondaga land. They are the firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and it is my hope that all that we do today honors the past, present, and future elders of the Onondaga Nation and for all Indigenous peoples. I'm gonna show some slides while I talk, and so I'm gonna start that share now. So I also want to ground us in the realities of what is happening in Palestine now, because one of the things that Christian Zionism does is it turns Palestine into a kind of theological construct instead of an actual place on earth. So what's happening right now in Palestine is that the Israeli government is planning, like literally at this moment, to demolish Palestinian homes in East Jerusalem. So when I talk about Palestine a lot, home demolitions almost always come up, and I just want to like really drive home, like imagine the house that you're in right now, if that's your home, or imagine your childhood home. That would be under demolition. Now imagine if your childhood home was also your parents' childhood home. And imagine your grandparents' childhood home. And imagine if your family had had that land since before the colonization of North America. That is what Palestinians are under threat of losing at this very moment. And the excuse that the state of Israel is giving for kicking Palestinians off of their land, the excuse they are giving for this ongoing ethnic cleansing today, is that they want to build a biblical theme park in the Palestinian neighborhood of Silwan, mostly designed for Christian tourists to come. Now, when we talk about Israeli support in the US, the main group that we think of usually are American Jews, because Israel claims itself as a Jewish nation. So of course it would be Jews in the US that are the biggest supporters. Well, that is not true. Christian Zionists are by far the largest supporters of Israel. And usually I'd give like this long argument with a lot of stats to show it, but that got made really easy for me when last year, the former Israeli ambassador to DC, Ron Dermer, gave this interview.
People have to understand the backbone of Israel's support in the United States is the evangelical Christians. That's the backbone. And it's true because of numbers and also because of their passionate and unequivocal support for Israel. Look at numbers. About 25%, some people think more, 25% of Americans are evangelical Christians. Less than 2% of Americans are Jews. You mentioned Reform Jews. I wouldn't necessarily separate them into different groups, but Reform Jews are about 1/3 of American Jews. The largest group of American Jews are those that are not affiliated with any denomination. So if you look just at numbers, you should be spending a lot more time doing outreach to evangelical Jews, evangelical Christians, than you would do to Jews. But also look at the passionate support. For most evangelicals in the United States, certainly for many of them, Israel is one of the most important issues to them. For some, it's number one. For others, it's maybe number 2 or number 3. You have abortion. Mm-hmm. You have the issue of religion and state and religious freedom in the United States. But those are really...
So there you have it from, from those in Israel whose job it was to gain support in the US. The recognition that evangelicals are a huge block in support of Israel. It's considered that 80% of evangelicals believe that the founding of Israel is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Now, that would make up, if the number of 25% of Americans are evangelical and 80% of that means 20% of the US population believes that Israel is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, or that 80% of US Americans are Christian Zionists. Now, what I want to highlight, and I'll do it kind of throughout, most people of that 20% wouldn't self-identify as Christian Zionists. It's maybe not even a concept that they know, but it's the air that we breathe in this country. It's the water that we drink that is tainted with Christian Zionism. Just to give you a stark understanding of how large this group is. Not just the group itself, not just Christian Zionists as a whole, but those that are politically involved, those that are a part of Christians United for Israel, make up about 8 million people, according to CUFI's own statistics. Compare that to AIPAC, which most of you have probably heard of, which considers itself one of the largest pro-Israel lobbies. It's down here, less than 10 times, or far less than, it's about 100,000 people only in their organization. So Christian Zionists are not only huge in number, as they were saying in the video, but also are very strongly or very well organized. And you saw this most clearly under the Bush presidency when Christians United for Israel co-founder John Hagee was able to go to the White House, was able to speak and actually give a prayer at the founding of the Jerusalem embassy by the US. And of course, Mike Pence came and spoke at Christians United for Israel Summit. And as Alison mentioned, she and I were also there. Now, I think it's important as we talk about Christian Zionism to understand the context that it came out of, the political context that it came out of, and how that political context kind of is still alive today in the ideology. So, first of all, Christian Zionism predates Jewish Zionism. It's long before, about a century before, Theodor Herzl was founding the secular Jewish movement of Zionism. British Christian leaders were already fixated on the idea that Jews should move to Palestine. Now, this was when Britain was at the height of its colonial expansion, and the popular Christian theology was deeply tied to that empire. So they viewed themselves as Christian soldiers, enacting God's battle plan from the Bible into the modern era, or as they would term it, dispensation. And they believed that Jewish rule of Palestine was part of God's strategy for winning. God's strategy also included converting all of the Jews to Christianity, or converting some Jews to Christianity, sending everyone who wasn't a Protestant to hell, and bringing about the apocalypse. That's what they were hoping to enact as they kind of fought up this ideology. And I think it's summed up in this picture well. So by the late 20th century, leading British politicians were deeply influenced by Christian Zionism. And this included Prime Minister David Lloyd George and Arthur Balfour, who famously legitimized the Zionist movement within the British government. So they supported the fledgling Jewish Zionist movement that definitely did not have the power to create a state in Palestine. But with the power of Britain behind them, the Jewish Zionist movement grew. Of course, this culminated in the Balfour Declaration, which gave Zionism international recognition and is still celebrated as a justification for the Zionist colonization of Palestine. To be clear, this Christian Zionism was and continues to be deeply anti-Semitic, as you can see by Lord Balfour's quote here. They fit very well together because anti-Semites at the time said Jews didn't belong in Europe, and Christian Zionists had a plan to get Jews out of Europe by sending them to Palestine. And political support and so this ideology then gets exported to the US and really attaches itself to the fundamentalist movement. Fundamentalist preachers loved the way that it ginned up a crowd. And the fundamentalist movement had a very similar kind of ideological fit where you had to have God's battle plan and you had to have an enemy, right? So like Palestinians and Muslims are the enemy of Christian Zionism. Within Christian Zionism are the enemies of God. In the US, the fundamentalist movement, the enemies were changed from time to time, right? At first it was evolution or science, people teaching science. Then it was school integration. Then women's rights. Then LGBTQ rights. There's always had to be an enemy. But one of the undergirding ideologies of this fundamentalism was the idea that Israel was a chosen state by God. And let me be clear, any ideology that says a state or group of people is chosen for special treatment and others are less is a racist ideology. And in my opinion, a racist ideology is always heretical. So Christian Zionism undergirded all of this because they could say our ideology must be right because we predicted a state of Israel and now there is one in 1948. And if you go to these Christian Zionist gatherings, you will hear very little theology. Very few people who believe Christian Zionist thought will have any understanding of what this chart says or care anything about dispensationalism. But it's the idea that they can predict the future. It's the idea that they are chosen or they are connected to those who are chosen. Right? It's why these evangelical groups love getting baptized in the Jordan River. Even though that's not the Jordan River, they literally took water from another place because the Jordan River has gotten so polluted. But evangelical Christian Zionists don't actually want the true story. They want a nice sparkly river to be baptized in and pretend that it's the Jordan. So I say all of this about the ideology in the background and the power of Christian Zionism because I believe that it's an opportunity. We have a massive group of people that are negatively influencing US policy. And although Palestine and Israel are a top tier issue. It's a top tier issue for Christian Zionists. It's basically the foreign policy of Christian nationalism. They are extremely uninformed of what's actually happening. Most Christian Zionists are incredibly insulated and don't actually know what's going on in Palestine. And I believe that if they did, both the extreme right wing and the more progressive Christian Zionists, if they knew more, if this ideology were exposed for the racist ideology that it is, we can actually see massive shift. So I believe that it's an opportunity. And with that, I will pass it over to Erica.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Again, if you have questions, be thinking about them, go ahead and put them in the chat. I'd now like to invite Reverend Erica Williams to speak to us. Erica Williams is a faith leader, organizer, international human rights activist, and community leader. She's the founding pastor of Set It Off Ministries, a national organizer with the Poor People's Campaign, but currently, and perhaps most pressing right now, she's a Harvard Fellow. Reverend Williams has a prophetic passion for challenging international and intersectional manifestations of evil, liberating poor and working class communities, and serving with her head and heart. Erica, it's good to have you with us, and we look forward to your work.
On July 18th, 2018, I was traveling from Bethlehem back to Israel. I was on a bus and we got to a checkpoint. When we got to the checkpoint, because I was an American citizen, I was allowed to stay on the bus. But all of the Palestinian people were asked to get off the bus by officers who carried guns, ones that I had never seen before, not in human life, but in movies and other places. Folks were forced off of the bus and made to go and sit on a bench outside the bus, and they were checked and asked questions by those officers. One officer came back on the bus and he asked me why had I been in Bethlehem, who was I there to see, and asked me, was I taking anything back into the state of Israel? As I sat there and I was scared, I noticed a young woman and her 2 children sitting on the bench outside being checked. I noticed the children crying and holding closely to their mother. And eventually they were allowed to come back onto the bus. I saw the anguish in the mother's eyes. I saw the tears in the children's eyes. And I saw them sitting there a few rows ahead of me, holding each other tight as this bus began to enter into Israel. And I never talked with the mother. I never got a chance to ask her what happened, but I could feel the pain. As a Black American living in the United States, or as I would say, the divided states of America, I know exactly what it feels like to be in a country or in a space where you are criminalized just for being. I know what it's like to take every move and to know that somebody's watching you and always waiting for a way to attack. And so as I traveled back into Israel, I felt very compelled and called to pray. I prayed to that brown-skinned Palestinian Jew. And I asked that Palestinian, I said, what was that? What was I seeing on this very bus? And what I felt deeply in my spirit was that Jesus was saying to me that this is the cries of my people. This is what is happening to the people there in Palestine. And that was only one example. Because as I traveled through Bethlehem, I was able to go into the refugee camps and to meet with people on the ground there and to hear their stories and to see how if they spoke out, that their very lives would be threatened from the water that they had on their house to be taken from them. And I know what that's like too as a Christian, being from Saginaw, Michigan, right next door to Flint, Michigan, where I know that people are still drinking bottled water 7 years after this water crisis is supposed to be declared over, but folks are still being impacted by a water crisis, where we say in the Poor People's Campaign, you can buy unleaded gas in Flint, but you can't buy unleaded water. So I asked that Palestinian, I said, please show me what it is that you would have for me to do, as I saw this young woman and her children, and I traveled throughout the Holy Land, and I felt so terrified as I saw people being definitely oppressed and being militarized by the Israeli officers there. And so as I came back to the United States, I began to do my own research and to understand why was it that these beautiful people in Palestine were allowed to be able to be oppressed and marginalized by a system. What I began to find out was that my very own people, the Christians, the ecclesia, those who were called out, who were the followers of that brown-skinned Palestinian Jew, were the main perpetrators of this violence. And so I began to make the question, I began to wonder and began to search and to see why. I asked questions of people in my own community, asked my own family members who had an allegiance to Israel. I said, what is this allegiance to? What is this credence to? Please tell me. And they said, well, Israel is the land of our ancestors. Israel is the land that God has given to God's chosen people. I said, well, who told you this? What information gave you the solid foundation to know that this was the truth? And so I speak from a viewpoint today as a Black American, because I know that a lot of people in my community have this very notion that Israel is the place of God, that it is the place that God holds clear to God's heart. And I've had family members and friends to visit Israel in the very basis of they were going to the Holy Land to see the place that God resides. And I wanted to ask them so badly, if this is where God resides, what in the hell did I have? The reason why the hell did I have to be there? Because if that was the place that God resided, I didn't want any parts of it, because what I saw was just what I see here in the United States. From the vantage of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for more revival, what we see is systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, militarism, and this distorted moral narrative. Everything that I see here in the United States, I saw there in Palestine. And so I said, if this is God's place, if this is God's chosen place, I don't want to follow this God. I don't want to be a follower of that Palestinian Jew Jesus, because that is not what I was taught. That is not what I believe. That is the ways of Jesus. I believe, as Jesus told us in his inaugural message in Luke 4:18, he said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, the house of Bethany, those made poor by society, to heal the brokenhearted, to set the captive free, and to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord now, which meant the Jubilee. And that is what I believe Jesus did. And that's what I believe he did. He came to set it off. He came to tear up the structures. He came to flip up the principalities and those powers that were oppressing not just his people, but all people who have been liberated and marginalized by the system. And so that is why I'm very clear today as I speak to you, and I don't know everything about Christian Zionism. Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you, Larry, and all those that will come behind me. But what I know, and I stand flat-footed in that, is that what I saw in Palestine was not the God that I serve. It was not the work of the Christian Jesus that I follow. I know that that was not it. And I know that what we see, not just taking place in Palestine, but even to Palestinians here in the US, the oppression and the marginalization that we see, it is not right. And it is in deep comparison to that of the Black lives struggle here in the US. So if you want to talk about Palestinian lives, you better also talk about Black lives, because we are all being oppressed by this same white supremacist colonial system. And it is time that we as the Christians Take our moral authority back and make sure that we don't allow for this to happen. I know that Kufi and all of them tried to claim Martin Luther King Jr. You can't claim him because he's not yours. Because Martin Luther King didn't really give an official stance on where he was. He went to Palestine on numerous occasions and he traveled. But I just believe if Martin had lived a few years longer, he would have understood that the same Poor People's Campaign that he tried to do here in the US, he would have done it in Palestine, because we do know that this work is international. It's global. It's not just a domestic oppression that we're fighting. It's all over the globe. And so I don't want for folks to think that just because I'm here today talking about Black lives, that I'm only doing this because I care about Black lives, but I'm doing this because God cares about all lives. And if there's anybody being oppressed or marginalized, we must see to it. We must make it our mission. We must make it our focus to make sure that we do the work of liberating those people. And let me change that, not those people, but liberate us. Because I want you to know white supremacy impacts all of us. I know a lot of you on this call today, you are my white sisters and kinfolks, sisters and brothers and kinfolks, but this is impacting all of us. Because here in this US of A, we did an audit on America called the Souls of Poor Folks, America from 1967 to current. And what we found were there 140 million poor, low-income folks in this nation. And 67 million of them are white. So America don't give a damn about white folks. It don't give a damn about Black folks. It don't give a damn about Palestinian folks. All it gives a damn about is its money. It's greed. And it will do anything to kill anybody that doesn't stand in the way of lifting up this white supremacist notion. So I hear the cries of the Palestinian people today. Because just like us Black folks here in the US, we sick and tired of being sick and tired. So I hope today that we've come to this session, not just to hear more stats, not just to hear about more things that are taking place, but for us to decide which side will we be on. I ask of you today, because the Palestinian children are crying just like Black children are crying, just like poor children are crying all over this nation, saying we just want to be free. And I know that's God's call. I know that was Jesus's call. And that is my call. And so that is why I'm here today with each of you, to say that Christian Zionism is not of God. It's not right. It's white supremacy at its best and its finest. And we, the church, must make our stance and say that the Palestinian lives matter and that we will stand on the side of Christ. And we will ensure that Zion, the real Zion, a place of peace and love and power, is made possible for all people, especially the Palestinian people. Ashe.
Ashe and amen.
Yeah.
Let's just pause for a moment and take a deep breath and let the spirit of life and liberation that has been proclaimed enter into your being. Reverend Williams, I thank you not just for your prophetic word, but for the way that you exampled what it means to talk to not just your spiritual sisters and brothers, but your literal brothers and sisters about having blind faith in things that are killing others, and why we need to have those tough conversations, and for modeling what that looks like. I want to invite Larry Hendel, our third guest, to come and share with us a little bit from his perspective as a lifelong member of Bay Area's Jewish Voice for Peace and a retired labor union representative. Larry's worked alongside Palestinians to challenge economic and cultural forms of oppression, and Larry and I have worked together to challenge walls of injustice and incarceration on an international scale. Larry, thank you for being here and being part of this conversation.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm totally blown away, I have to say, by the comments I've heard. And only having read about the movement against Christian Zionism, it's very impressive to hear you all and be part of this. I'm calling from the Bay Area, as Alison said, an occupied Ohlone land. And I so appreciate this webinar and the stands your organization has taken. I also want to acknowledge the samud, the heroism and the courage of Palestinians as we talk about this movement. The phrase that they say there of existence equals resistance is not just a catchy slogan. The more we see, hear, and read about what is happening there bears that out. And we need to always keep that in mind. Pastor Williams' comments reminded me of my experiences in Palestine, and I'm sure others have had similar ones or read about them, watching people wait for hours at checkpoints to just get from one side of their village to another, with no reason given, just arbitrary, and seeing things like Bedouin villages being destroyed and then rebuilt, dozens and dozens of times. I mean, the inhumanity of the Israeli government is just staggering. And as a Jew, it's mind-boggling. There's so many of us who just can't believe that people of what we see as our tradition of Jewish values is what they're doing. And then they use the Holocaust as the kind of justification for why their lives are more important and why their so-called right to the territory there is more valuable than the Palestinians' right. Even though, as Erica talked about, or Jonathan, I can't remember which, but anyway, that the houses there have been, occupied by generations and generations of Palestinians, and there are very few Israelis who can actually say that their grandparents or certainly not their great-grandparents were there, whereas the bulk of Palestinians can trace their lineage way back. Anyway, that's just an extraordinary. This movement is extraordinary, and as a Jew, and I'm blown away and inspired by those of you from the Christian faith, who don't have that sense of or a different sense of responsibility for this, for what's happening there, and the passion that you are showing is very wonderful. JVP, for those who don't know, is a national organization. There's 60 chapters around the country, 10,000 individual donors, and over 200,000 supporters on our mailing list. Generally speaking, our goals are to bring together Jews who are opposed to what Israel is doing to the Palestinians, and to create a presence within the Jewish community and the community at large to counter the propaganda of Jewish groups such as the Anti-Defamation League, and locally here in California, the Jewish Community Relations Council, who I just have to say, are on a tear. I mean, these groups, they know they're being threatened by the international movement against Zionism. And similar to the Republicans, frankly, they feel cornered and they're attacking. And they are formidable enemies. Enemies, I don't mean that in a, as a human sense. I'm not saying, it's not a military thing. Adversaries, I guess, is a better word. And I think we continually have to up our game and realize that they are not, anyway, that they're working behind the scenes and doing whatever they have to can to manipulate the system in their behalf. Jewish Voice for Peace has a staff of 27 people. We do a lot of outreach to Jewish institutions and organizations, as well as congressional lobbying, educational work. And most recently, we created a political action committee called JVP Action, which focuses on political action and legally permits us to endorse and support candidates for office, and congressional office. So we're working, we see that as a major change actually in our abilities to influence policy in this country. Personally, I've been working hard the last year or two on the ethnic studies campaign in California, in coalition with Arab Americans primarily, and the Block the Boat campaign, which was an extraordinarily exciting thing here in the Bay Area, where a Zim Israeli liner, from the Zim Corporation, which is the Israeli shipping company, 7 or so years ago, the community blocked them from unloading here in cooperation with the Longshoremen's Union here. But they came back just a few months ago. They tried to, and we were able to turn the ship around again with hundreds of people showing up, being there from like 5 in the morning all day. Actually had to come back the next day too. But we were successful in turning it around. It was amazing. One of the main things we've been focusing on, and I think is very relevant to this webinar, has been to challenge a primary ideological talking point of Zionist organizations who constantly equate any criticism of Israel to anti-Semitism. By definition, if you criticize Israel, you're criticizing Jews and you're anti-Semitic. So this is a rhetorical device. It's not new, but they're emphasizing it. They're fanning it up. It's kind of like in Star Trek when the commander says, shields up when they're being attacked. So this shield that everything that's criticized of Israel is anti-Semitic, they never have to deal with the content of the criticism. We've seen this in the recent struggle of the model curriculum for ethnic studies that I was talking about in California. And we see it all the time in the debate over the BDS movement. So following up on this topic, and I don't know if this is part of your, on your radar, if you will, there's an organization called the International Holocaust Remembrance Association, and they are putting forward a definition of anti-Semitism, which they say should be put into legislation. National statements, governments around the world should do it as when they talk about anti-Semitism. And part of this definition says, and I'm quoting here, that denying the Jewish people their right to denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, for example, by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor, unquote, that is anti-Semitic by definition. And we have to oppose this. It's coming up all over. And I know JVP and other pro-Palestinian organizations are opposing it wherever they can. We would ask your organizations to oppose the usage of this definition also and challenge it wherever it pops up. Having said that, we are not, as a JVP, ignoring the rise of anti-Semitism in the US, not at all. But we strongly believe that the main sources of anti-Semitism are not Arabs or critics of Israel, but are white nationalism and white supremacy. In Charlottesville, when people marched and said, Jews will not replace us, those people were not Arabs. They were not critics of Israel at all. They were right-wing, white nationalists and white supremacists. So consistent with that understanding of where anti-Semitism comes from here, we as an organization, do our best to ally ourselves with people who are being targeted because of their race, religion, or national origin, and strongly and consistently oppose white nationalism and white supremacy. And we just, coming off of what other people have said too, it's wonderful to see the support of Palestinians within the Black Lives Matter movement and the struggles of Native Americans for their right to self-determination. The narrative that there is a conflict between Israeli and Palestine, I'm saying conflict in quotes, that's what it is. It's just a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. They don't like each other. They're going to fight forever and ever, which is what a lot of Americans think. But more and more people are understanding that Israel is a settler colonial state and oppressing Palestinians in the same way that the US is and has been, and taking and exploiting the land of indigenous people here. You see it at Standing Rock and at Line 3, the demonstrations that are going on in the Native American community. You often see Palestinian flags being held up and waved. It's amazing. That wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. It wouldn't. It's a testament to the work that, well, primarily what the Palestinians have done, but also what all of us in this movement have done to educate people around the country about what the nature of Israel is. Changing the subject slightly, I want to talk about the changing attitudes towards Israel within the Jewish community. Jonathan talked about this earlier, but you may have seen a poll that's a few months old. It was taken by the Jewish Electorate Institute, and we're going to have a link to it in the chat. This poll is extraordinary. They interviewed voters, Jewish voters, and based on the poll, a quarter of Jewish American voters agree that Israel is an apartheid state. That number shoots up to 38% among those under the age of 40. That is staggering. Can you imagine? 10 years ago, nobody would have said that. Nobody in quotes, but to call Israel an apartheid state, that's because the BDS movement has been strong. And those of us who support it, it's absolutely worked, in my opinion. At least it may not see more boycotts and more divestment or sanctions, although we're seeing some. But from a talking point, if you will, or a place to begin the discussion, it has been an amazing campaign. Continuing on the poll, 22% of Jewish voters overall agree that Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians. And again, significantly, that number rises to 33% among people under the age of 40. And finally, 34% of Jewish voters surveyed agree that Israel's treatment of Palestinians is similar to racism in the United States. And again, that figure goes to 40% for those under age of 40. So we have to credit the Palestinians first and foremost, but it's also a testament to this movement and the progress that we've been making, even though, as I said, the Zionists fight hard and fight dirty, but it's an extraordinary development, and says to me that especially with that and what others have been saying about the Christian Zionism, it brings even more significance to the Christian anti-Zionist, to the unity between Christian anti-Zionists and Jewish anti-Zionists and all anti-Zionist movements. We need more and more unity, and we will prevail on that. I put several links in the chat for your reference. One is a link to JVP. One is, you can go and link to the poll that I was talking about. It's actually an article about the poll, but in that article, you can also link the actual poll. And also, slightly off the subject, there's a video about the oppression of Christians in Palestine called "The Stones Cry Out," and it's in the chat too. And I hope you, if you have not seen that, I totally recommend it, because the Israelis, if you're Palestinian, they don't really care if you're Christian, or it's not just a Muslim thing. They don't care what religion you are at all. You're Palestinian, end of story, and your land can be taken and all that, and was taken. Finally, and I'll put this in the chat, there is a book by a local author here called "Determined to Stay, Palestinian Youth Fight for Their Village," which is about Silwan, which Jonathan mentioned, and the attempt of the Israelis to turn their village of generations into a Disneyland, an Israeli Disneyland about Jewish archaeology, or misinterpreting archaeology of the region to say that this was King David's place, and just to use it as a way to do more Zionist propaganda. Thank you again for letting me speak here. I totally learned a lot and appreciated everything I've heard, and kudos to your movement and whatever we can do to assist, whatever resolutions, etc. Happy to do so, and thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Jewish Voice for Peace has in many ways been leading the way in what it means to claim the liberative nature of your religion and wrest it from ways in which it's been co-opted for political purposes. And your example is worth lifting up and is worth emulating. Wow, we've heard a lot. We've heard a lot of really important, really powerful information. The chat has already shared a few different ways in which we can respond to the evils of Christian Zionism through inviting Palestinians to come speak at our churches, to approaching Christian Zionists and Christian Zionist conventions or within our families. And education is a powerful reclaiming of what's really happening, and acknowledging both what's happening and what we long for, what we're working for. Before we move to Q&A, I'd like to give each of our speakers just about 1 minute to simply answer the question. Now that we've heard all this, now that we've felt the pain, now that we've been horrified by the statistics, what can we do? What can we do? Jonathan, would you like to share first?
Sure. There's so much to that we can do, because the U.S. is giving $3.8 billion a year to support the Israeli military. All of that money is going directly to the Israeli military, and that's for each of you. If you pay taxes, that's $20 that you personally have donated to the Israeli military and their colonization of Palestine. So
every year, huh?
Every year. So I think for me, that's motivation. That's motivation that I'm already part of the problem. And once I've realized I'm part of the problem, it becomes really easy to recognize ways to be part of the solution, right? What are organizations that are working for freedom, justice, and equality for Palestinians that you can give $40 to offset that? What are actions that you can take? What are Palestinians asking for now? And right now, with what's going on in Silwan, there are people organizing to support the Palestinian efforts to save their homes. So I'm going to name that one right now. This is a toolkit. It was specifically for a month of action last month, but it still has a lot of resources for how you can take local action. It helps you call Congress. And then, yeah, I'll leave it at that one since I'm only supposed to give one, because I could give so many more.
Erica.
Yeah, so I think that's, Jonathan, I'm in total agreement with you. And that's one of the calls, even for the Poor People's Campaign, is seeing the money that is being sent to Israel. And we have a saying in the campaign, we got money for wars, but can't feed the poor. That's in the words of Tupac Shakur. If you don't know who that is, look him up. But I would honestly say one thing is we have to look and see where we are concerning this issue, and to check our own, see where our own mind is around this. So to do the research, to check where we are, and to really see, as I ask the question, which side are we on? And then once we can say with sure confidence where we are, we must begin to get more knowledge about this. So being involved in groups like this, I would say look up the Adala Justice Project is one of my key groups. That is the group that helped me when I went to Palestine by myself. I just went, they've helped me and connected me to people on the ground. So please look up Adala Justice Project. I'll put it in the chat. And then also check out the Samuel Dewitt Proctor Conference. That is an organization here in the US. It's started by Reverend Dr. Samuel Dewitt Proctor, and they do a lot of work with Palestine. Dr. Torian Webb, who's with the Black Christians for Palestine group, and a lot of other folks who have done some tremendous work on how to get this information to congregations. So maybe you partner with a Black congregation, or just have have someone come to your congregation and to begin to have these conversations. So Adala Justice Project, Samuel Dewitt Proctor, and number one, to thine own self, check and see where you are concerning Palestine and Israel.
Thank you, Reverend Williams. Larry.
Well, just thank you for this. On the legislative front, as people, Jonathan and others have been talking about, we know your organization has endorsed HR 2590, or at least the predecessor bills from Betsy McCollum, which basically makes it illegal to spend US dollars on housing demolitions, human rights violations against Palestinian children, and things such as administrative detention without any due process, and further annexation of Palestinian land. So if there's a way for the organizations and others, JVP is making this a major effort, to talk to your legislators to endorse HR 2590. They have 30 co-sponsors at this point, which sounds small, but it grows every year. She's done similar bills every year. And I'll just leave it at that because of time, but that would be a very important statement to make.
Thank you. And on behalf of the Community for Justice in Palestine and Israel, we are beseeching the Alliance as an organization, all the individual congregations as churches, and the individuals here to, one, take seriously the call to challenge Christian Zionism in our churches, in our families, in our communities, within the Alliance. Two, make a public commitment to decry the evils of Christian Zionism and disrupt its power. And one of the powerful ways that we can do this as an alliance is through passing a statement on confronting and challenging Christian Zionism. And this fall, that statement will be up for a vote. We're going to put both the statement in the chat, as well as 2 opportunities to discuss this statement on Tuesday evening, October 5th. I believe that's at 7 p.m. Eastern time, 4 p.m. California time, or 4 p.m. Pacific time for all who live in the Pacific Coast. And then also Sunday, October 17th at 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific. We invite you to read the statement, to think about it, to do more research on it, to discuss the statement with us, and then to vote in the affirmative so that we as Alliance can make public our commitment to challenge Christian Zionism. And I'm also going to put within the statement, we have a list of resources for you to read, different denominations that have already taken strong commitments to challenging the oppression of the Palestinian people, as well as a reading list of books so that you can learn more on your own. And with that, I want to make sure that we have about 10 minutes now, 10-15 minutes for some questions. I want to make sure you've heard a lot, and I want to make sure you have a chance to really raise some of the questions. What has this been stirring up for you? And I'm going to call on Leslie Withers from our community to give us some questions.
Well, the first one that comes up is, suppose I'm talking to a friend who is a reasonable person, but is convinced that Israel is the Holy Land that was given to the Jews by God because the Bible says so. What can I say to that person? And that could be either an elevator speech, or perhaps you want to list some resources for a more detailed kind of answer.
Who would like to take that one?
I can go ahead, Erica.
No, go, Jonathan. I'll go with you.
As far as resources for people that are within this ideology, the book that has been most effective, that the most people who are like, I was a Christian Zionist, then I read this book, has been Blood Brothers by Elias Shakur. Another book, if people really want to like get into the theological arguments and want an alternative theological argument that still doesn't require them to give up too much of their ideas, Gary Burge is a thinker and author who has written extensively on kind of giving evangelical arguments against Christian Zionism. But I think that the key thing that the thing that I try to get across to people is, I don't believe that God is a racist real estate agent. And I might use, kinder language than that, but that's the like, if they can recognize that what they're saying is that God is a racist real estate agent, then probably they're going to recognize they don't actually hold that belief very deeply.
Jonathan, could you put those books in the chat, please?
And I think I want to, Erica, did you want to say something as well to this? So I want to say something just because as a white person, I have an obligation to interrupt racism whenever I hear it, regardless of how good I think the person is who's spewing it. I have an obligation to disrupt racist comments, to disrupt racist statements, to disrupt racist structures. And the same is true when I see all oppressive structures and statements, that we have a responsibility as Christians to stand with the oppressed and to challenge and disrupt every form of evil. Is there another question?
I haven't seen one in the chat. Perhaps if someone has a question, they could raise their hand. You can do that by going to, reactions at the bottom of your screen and put up your raise hand function if you've got a question.
And I noticed Ben Wagner raised his hand, so I'm going to give him a chance to speak.
What I hear so often is Palestinians are just the ones behind Hamas. and they will use that as their excuse to say, well, forget they're sending missiles into our country, into their country, so they're just at war, and how can we support Hamas? And that's what comes to me often. You say, Hamas is the problem of not looking at what's happening to the Palestinians. What would you answer with that?
That's a great question, and also one that is used to silence any conversation about what's really happening. Who wants to take that one? First of all, I'd hate to think that anyone would align me with the former regime of this country and say that's clearly what I think, because I'm part of this country.
Larry, you're muted.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think any of us think Hamas is a wonderful organization, but if the Israelis would give the Palestinians their right to self-determination and help figure out what without oppressing them, then they will work it out. I mean, we can't, step in and pick sides and stuff like that. Obviously, and that sounds like a maybe Pollyanna statement, but I absolutely believe politically it's true that if the Israeli government would negotiate in good faith with people from the West Bank and from Gaza, most of whom are still refugees, by the way, and living in refugee camps in Gaza. Terrible conditions. The open air prison concept you've all heard, the largest open air prison in the world. I mean, it's a horrible situation. Of course, a group like Hamas is going to flourish there a little bit. I just would just say that. And if you want to talk about a military comparison, I mean, you can look at the weaponry of the Israeli military versus what Hamas has. It's nothing. And when they don't, and when they demonstrate peacefully, like in the Greater March for Return, the thing a couple of years ago on the border, they get bombed, they get slaughtered. So of course, people are going to resort to violence.
And to just top on that, we should also ask the question: what was the problems that created Hamas? Like, let's think about that. Like, we're always so quick to want to point the finger at that. And I think that's what has been done in a lot of ways in the Black community against the Nation of Islam. When people always want to attack and say the Nation of Islam was this supremacist, nationalist group. But my conversation is, what created the Nation of Islam? I think that's the question that we must begin to consider, is what created Hamas. And my thing is, like you said, Brother Larry, I think we must be very clear is that until the people get what they need, there will be no peace. I think folks in the streets in the US said that this summer: if we don't get no justice, you don't get no peace. And so I think Hamas is a clear indication as to what Palestinian people and folks are saying. And so I think we just have to look at what created the conditions of this group, and we must address that. I think we can't point the blame until we find out the root cause.
We also let them be included in the peace talks. They should be included in the peace talks. Why just say they're a terrorist group? That's one of my answers to this.
And I also want to recognize that we just lived through the commemoration of the attacks of 9/11, and we mourned for the 3,000 plus who died, but not the millions who died in the aftermath because of our attacks. And so when you look at what Hamas has done versus what Israel has done, when you look at who is promoting violence in the Middle East, let's be clear about what's happening. Let's name the biggest oppressors, and then we can hold everyone accountable to our part.
Thank you. Thank you.
Are there other, we have time for one more question, and then we have a closing. And if there aren't any more questions, we can switch to the closing. But if there are any other burning questions, go ahead and name them, and please do read our statement. For Alliance folks, read our statement and show up at our discussions and plan to vote at our fall gathering.
Yes, I came just to learn. I'm woefully ignorant about a lot of this. I understand the principles of every person counts in the sight of God, and therefore in our sight, hopefully. I understand the battle has been going on for centuries there, but I like the idea of the Alliance making a strong statement. I gather that statement's already been written. I hope that it will, curious as to how it's going to be promoted and publicized. There are only 30 some of us on this call, and hopefully many more times that on the discussion, and then at the time of voting in October. What are the plans for making sure that this gets the attention it needs?
Thank you. It has been published in Connections and in eBlasts. It will continue to be published. We will share this webinar so that folks can hear from our amazing speakers. And we have discussions discussion times have already been set so that we can really look at how it's written, and if people want to suggest any wordsmithing. There is a link to the statement in the chat so that you can see it and begin looking at it and sharing any comments or suggestions that you have for it. So thank you for that. I am going to invite GJ at this point, a longtime member of the Alliance of Baptists, good friend, and someone from the diaspora from Gaza, as I recall. Please, GJ, give us your final words and blessing on this important discussion.
Well, thank you, and thank you to the speakers for a wonderful dialogue that you've generated with us, and not only that, but laying the seeds in each of us as what we need to do. And as a Palestinian Christian whose family goes back to Gaza, to one of the world's oldest still active churches in Gaza called St. Porphyrius Orthodox Church. It was built in the 5th century. And my family's baptismal certificates, they didn't have birth certificates. Most of them were born in home, but the church kept their baptismal certificates, and those certificates go back to the 1750s in Gaza. So, and I am deeply moved by my faith community at the Alliance of Baptists. I'm a member of Ravensworth Baptist Church, and we were one of the first 14 churches who founded the Alliance of Baptists. And we're so proud of that. And I want to remind everybody, this activity, as we move forward, we're not alone. I sincerely believe who moves with us is God's Spirit. As we work together, our efforts are multiplied by the Spirit, and that Spirit calls us to love and justice. And I'm excited, and I want to follow up on some of the things that our speakers gave us. And if you don't mind, Alison, can I read a closing prayer?
Please.
This closing prayer is from the Church of Scotland, and it's a little bit long, but be patient with me. It might take a little bit more than a couple of minutes, okay? So let's take a deep breath. Take in all that information and how that information is feeding our souls. God of justice, bless those who work for peace through justice. Strengthen their resolve in the face of seemingly endless violence. Guide the leaders of the people of the Middle East to know your will and to support a just peace for all your children. God of love, lifting up the Holy Land for all humankind. Breathe love and compassion into our prayers with a desire for nothing other than peace. Peace in our hearts, peace for all creation, and especially peace in the land that is called holy. God of mercy, even as we long to understand that which is often beyond our comprehension, we lay before you the hearts, minds, and bodies of all those suffering from the conflict in Palestine and Israel, from the ongoing occupation. Shower upon all the people of the Holy Land the spirit of justice and reconciliation. God of the nations, give to all our people the blessings of well-being, freedom, and harmony, and above all things, give us faith in you that we may be strengthened to care for all those in need until the coming of your Son. Amen.
Amen. May it be so. We have our work to do, Alliance. We're in good hands.